I want you to open your Bibles up to Judges chapter 6. Judges chapter 6 is where our lesson will come from this morning. It's good to be with you. Hope everybody had a great week. Fired up for another week. Last week, beautiful weather. It was 2 of our kids' birthdays. Out of the 5 kids, we have 4 birthdays in a 2-week span. So that is interesting. You just leave the birthday sign up for the month. It's everybody's birthday. And with the weather being a little warm, had some little bit of cold. You probably had a great week, didn't you? Not everybody had a great week. That's really a challenge of preaching, really, and teaching. Some people had a really bad week. Tornadoes ravaged parts of the South, as they generally do in the spring. But Arkansas felt it. Mississippi felt it. And for those people, last week was a really bad week. Life-changing, life-taking for some family members. And when I stand before you and think about giving a lesson, it's just a difficult thing because some of you have had a great week and some of you are suffering. Imagine, this is how I want to convey it to you. Imagine if 300 people came and stood in front of the doctor and was like, tell us something medically. Well, some of you may need diet and exercise. Some of you may need to diet and exercise less. Some of you may need encouragement. Some of you may need consoling. Everybody's different and unique, and it's the same way with the Word of God. It is hard to know exactly what to say for everybody. And so this morning's lesson may not mean a thing to you. You may not be struggling. But for some people, they struggle when they go through life's challenges to simply answer this question: where is God? Where has God been? Where is God when I needed Him? Where is God last week when my house was destroyed and my family killed? Where has God been when I've been struggling in life, and I come sit by somebody here at church and all the preacher talks about was how great his week was? Where is God? And I don't wish that this lesson is applicable to you. I don't wish that you're going through a difficult time or that your life in general may be more difficult than somebody else's. But what I want to share with you this morning is that if your life finds you in the very place that Gideon was, I've got some help for you. And I've got some good news. And I want to share that with you this morning. And maybe your life's great and you're not struggling. Well, I want you to take this lesson and write some notes, because when you hit the wall, you'll be like, hey, I remember a lesson one time when I was down, and maybe this lesson will be of help to you then. I'm glad you're here this morning. I can't wait to read this with you and try to learn some things from the Bible. That's what we're here for. And as such, I got some news to share. I got a new Bible that I'm going to be reading from. So my old one finally died. It's weird to say that about a Bible, but it was duct taped. And one day I was coming to preach and I noticed parts of the Bible missing. That's a no-no for a preacher. There were several places I couldn't turn to. So it was time to get a new Bible, and I was looking to get a new one. And I was asking some preacher friends, I was asking some people, hey, do you have Bibles you recommend? And I was looking around, and I got a new Bible that I'd never even heard of. It's called the Legacy Standard Bible. And it's attempting to be faithful to the text, which is what you want out of a translation. I don't want to paraphrase. I don't want what somebody thinks. Like, give me the words that were written in my language. And so this Bible attempts to do that. It's an offshoot of the New American Standard, which I used to use. But it's got one significant detail that's different that will probably annoy you today if you're not ready for it. It's going to use the actual name of God instead of what almost all English translations have done for hundreds of years, where they translate it Lord, but it's not really the word. It's His name, Yahweh, which you hear people say from time to time. But that's what's actually written in the Hebrew. And it's significant because there are a lot of names for God. If you start out in the Old Testament in Genesis, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and that's a word for God that's different than when God says in Exodus 3 to Moses, when Moses said, hey, I'm supposed to go to Pharaoh, who am I going to tell Pharaoh sent me? And your translation may say, tell him God sent you. Well, that doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense when he thinks of God as somebody different, but in the original it says, Tell him Yahweh is the one that sent you. And that's the name that God said in Exodus chapter 3. I think I got it bookmarked. God goes on to say, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial name from generation to generation. And so, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, two different Hebrew words. And so I appreciate that the translation is trying to be faithful to the text. That's what you want in any translation. And so I didn't want that to surprise you as I'm reading through Judges. And it uses the name of Yahweh, but we're going to read it while it's there. So I wanted to get that out of the way so you're not distracted. Again, it's called the Legacy Standard Bible, and appreciate your feedback and thoughts on some of that too if you've been reading it. All right, let's dig in then and try to answer the question, where is God when times are tough? And I picked this story in Judges chapter 6 because it's just a typical example of someone's life in Israel. They're going through a tough time. Let's start reading in verse 1. And the sons of Israel did what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh, and Yahweh gave them into the hands of Midian, which was another nation, 7 years. And the power of Midian prevailed against Israel. Because of Midian, the sons of Israel made for themselves the dens which were in the mountains, in the caves, in the strongholds. And it was when Israel had sown that the Midianites would go up with the Amalekites and the sons of the east and go up against them. And so they would camp against them and ruin the produce of the earth as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance in Israel, as well as no sheep or ox or donkey. For they would go up with their livestock and their tents, and they would come in like locusts for number. Both they and their camels were innumerable, and they came into the land to make it a ruin. So Israel was brought very low because of Midian, and the sons of Israel cried out to Yahweh. All right, so let's pause here to make sure we understand the story. It sounds tragic, but let me just put it in terms that we could understand. So imagine you go through Chick-fil-A and you spend $60 on Chick-fil-A, and you get out of the drive-thru, and as soon as you get out of the drive-thru, there's some people with guns, and they open up the doors and they come to your car and they say, "Give me that bag of food, Logan." And you say, "Okay, I'm going to do it." And then you don't notice, but it's happening in every restaurant in town, that there's these armed guards that every time somebody goes through the drive-thru, they're taking their food. And so people are having that happen at Ingles and Kroger and Publix, that whenever you would have a truck of food come in, or whether you would buy your groceries and you would leave, people would rob you of those groceries the minute you would get outside in the parking lot. Now, that's kind of annoying, isn't it? Because you need food to live. This is not like, oh, they're taking some money out of your bank account and you still got, you can still kind of get along. No. This is happening from a country coming in from the east and crossing over the Jordan all the way to the west to Gaza. So this is happening across a large part of Israel. That these innumerable people are roving and they're taking the produce of people as soon as it's produced. And Israel cries out to God. And in these moments, down in verse 11, it says, "The angel of Yahweh came and sat under the oak that was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abizrite, as his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress in order to preserve it from the Midianites. And the angel of Yahweh appeared to him and said to him, 'Yahweh is with you, O mighty man of valor.' And Gideon said to him, 'O my Lord, if Yahweh is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his wondrous deeds which our fathers recounted to us, saying, Did not Yahweh bring us up from Egypt? But now Yahweh has abandoned us, given us into the hand of Midian.' Then Yahweh turned to him and said, 'Go in this strength of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Have I not sent you?' But he said to him, 'O Lord, with what shall I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the least in Manasseh, and I'm the youngest in my father's house.'" And so I want you to appreciate the text here for a minute. That we have come onto the scene of a very broken person. Now, Gideon, by all accounts, is doing something unusual. It says he is beating out the wheat in the winepress to try to hide it from Midian. And so again, given that you probably neither beat wheat out or have a winepress, let me just explain to you what that would be like. We talked about how people are stealing your Chick-fil-A. It would be like then you having to produce food down at the Ace Hardware. And you're having to get different places where we're going to try to store food because people are looking for our food and they're coming to take all these things. And so he's trying to hide it so that he will have something to eat. And so while the Israelites are living in caves and dens and are hiding in the rocks and the hills, all of a sudden it says the angel appears to him. I don't think he really appreciates what's happening. And says, "Hey, why don't you go stop Midian? God is with you." And so when you think about this perspective for a minute, I mean, just imagine a mess of a life in this current situation. And he asks some very normal questions in response to this. I mean, here he is struggling to survive, and his people are struggling to survive, and this has been happening for years upon years. And his first question to the angel of Yahweh is this: if God is with me and God is with us, why did he let things get so bad? Now, I'm paraphrasing there, but that's basically what he says here in the verse. He says, if Yahweh is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And this is a very normal thing to ask. You know, people in this life, when they're going through tough times, or your house gets hit by a hurricane, or a tornado, or you're going through some struggle in your life that may be personal in nature, you got some cancer diagnosis or whatever it is, and you ask this simple question, well, why would God let these things happen to me? If God is with me, and you hear all this talk in church about God being with you, and you got a relationship with God, and all of a sudden my life is going sideways, why would God allow these things to get so bad? And look, I'll say a few things about this. I think it's very easy to look at our problems and start to ask questions about where God is. Very easy, right? I mean, we expect in this life, I think it's an unspoken expectation, that as somebody that's a pretty decent person, then my life ought to be pretty decent. I mean, good things ought to happen to me. I'm a pretty good guy. Give my mom a Mother's Day card. No, that's a bad example. I don't always do that. But I'm a pretty decent guy. And as a decent person, good things ought to happen to me. And so we tend to get our mindset thinking that somehow in our life and in our situation and our circumstances, that God is the problem. Now, a lot of times, point number 2 is true too. You know, we start looking around and we start comparing our lives to everybody else, and we start even digging a deeper hole. That as we come to church and we sit by people that maybe are more well off and they're more healthy and they're more happy and good things are happening to them, and my life is a mess, then we can almost feel worse about our situation. Because, hey, guess what? Well, I'm starving. The Midianites are eating. I mean, these people are eating good. And what benefit is there to me to kind of living in this life? And I think God is ultimately, in a lot of our problems, very easy to blame. God could do something. God should do something. God didn't do something. So don't you start telling me God is with me. Because if he was, then why has all this happened to me? And I think especially as a Christian, we tend to fall into the same struggles that maybe Gideon did too in his second comment back to the angel here. He said, almost in the same breath, and yeah, why has this happened to us? And where are all his miracles? The wondrous deeds which our fathers recounted to us, saying, did not Yahweh bring us up from Egypt? And what stories those would be. I mean, could you imagine being someone that was a descendant of someone that lived through the Exodus from Egypt? To hear the stories about how at one day all these crazy things were happening, but God protected Israel. And how the Egyptians were losing cattle and doing things, and it was dark there, but we had lights in our homes, and how their firstborn was ultimately slain, and God brought us out, and we had all this wealth and money. And how God led them through the sea on dry land. And how God saved them from the Egyptian army because the land then swallowed them up as the water closed in on them. And it was just this wonderful thing. And as the children are hearing that story from their parents, they're believing it. But after a generation, and another generation, and another generation, and another generation, then you're starting to wonder, are those just stories? And we hear it all the time, and we ask ourselves, as our life is difficult, is God really the God that does all these things? Where are all the miracles that I read about? And we think about, and I'll just put these points up there. When we don't see God in our lives, and we don't see God's hand, and we don't understand God, let me tell you where our thoughts go. Our thoughts go to a place of doubt, and those doubts continue to be reinforced with God is just a story, and the things that He's done for me are not true, and they're not real, and I'm in this life, and I'm experiencing this life, and I'm alone because all this stuff is just made up in the Bible. Where are all His wondrous deeds that you guys have been talking about? And we wonder in our life, where is God? And we feel forsaken by God. And that's ultimately what Gideon is saying. God has abandoned us. Where is God? God is long gone. And we tend to look at our lives and we say, I don't think I can make it through the difficulties in my life. I got some pictures there of the stairs at Amicalola Falls. Thankfully, they have several roads you can drive to see the falls at different places. But, if you choose to walk up the hundreds of stairs, remember there's signs at the bottom that say, warning, this is pretty strenuous. And if you ever tried it, there's probably a point you get up halfway through and you think, why did I try this? They tried to warn me. It's a little tough. And sometimes we can stand at the bottom of life's challenges and we can look up at all the stairs and we think, man, I'm never going to make it back to the top. I'm never going to get back to the way things were. I'm never going to be able to be the kind of person I'm supposed to be. Notice what the text says. When Gideon goes back to God, he says in verse 14, when God says, go in the strength of yours. And he says in verse 15, behold, my clan is the least in Manasseh, and I am the youngest in my father's house. And I think a lot of times that's how we face life. We look at our challenges and we look at who we are and we say, look, I'm unable to do the things I need to do in this life. I can't do it. Now you can say, please go and save Israel. And that's what God is explaining to him. But all he does is he turns to God and says, you want me to do it? Let me tell you, I am. We're from a particularly small family, and I'm the particularly worst person in this family. And this is going to be a story about how God uses weakness and people that wouldn't appear to have any strength or skill, and God can look at them and say, oh yeah, no, you can do it. But when we look at ourselves and our own ability, yeah, it's going to be pretty depressing. When you look at yourself, yeah, I probably can't do it. And our lives may be something that is full of tragedy and difficulty, and we look at ourselves and we're unable to accomplish and we're unable to do anything in this life. And all of these can be very real things. And that's where Gideon was. Gideon, who, by the way, is going to demonstrate here for all of us, for all time, somebody of great faith. But right now at the beginning, Gideon is asking these questions. Where is God? Where is God? God has left us. I'm unable to do this stuff alone, and we're just going to sit here in this horrible existence. And I want to share with you 3 things from the text that will explain to you exactly where God is in our times of difficulty and trouble. If you got your Bible still open to Judges chapter 6, I want to read a few verses that we skipped earlier, starting in verse 6. Now Israel was brought very low because of Midian, and the sons of Israel cried out to Yahweh. Now it happened when the sons of Israel cried out to Yahweh on account of Midian, that Yahweh sent a prophet to the sons of Israel. And he said to them, thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, It was I who brought you up from Egypt and brought you out of the house of slavery. I delivered you from the hands of the Egyptians and from the hands of all your oppressors and drove them out before you and gave you their land. And I said to you, I am Yahweh your God. You shall not fear the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live, but you have not listened to my voice. I want to share with this with you in point number one. As you answer the question, where is God in my life? I want to make this point. Number one, God has been talking to you. When you wonder where God has been, and you're looking for the voice of God, and you're feeling alone in your struggles and your challenges, and you don't want to hear about God because you think God hasn't been around, God has been talking to you. It's so interesting to me that in this story of victory and the story of Gideon and the great text in chapter 7 about them blowing the trumpets and bashing the pots and using the torches and scaring the Midianites and all those things, that it started with a prophet. That when Israel was out at their worst, this is what God had done. God had sent a messenger, a minister, a preacher to come tell them, you haven't been living the way you ought to live. And all your problems can be tied back to the poor choices that you've made. And the people, it said, did not listen. And so isn't that funny? That you have Gideon asking this question, hey, where's God? And God, long before, has like, I've been trying to talk to you guys for a while. I've been trying to explain to you exactly what your problems are and what you need to do and how you can repair this relationship and how you can experience blessings again, but you haven't been listening to me. Let me ask you this question this morning. Are you wondering where God has been in your life? God's been here the whole time. Through His Son, explaining to you everything He needs you to do in order to get your life turned around. Now, you might not have wanted to listen, and you might not like what God is saying, but God has been speaking. Hebrews says in these last days, He didn't use a prophet, He spoke to us by His Son. And that through the voice of His own Son, God said, they may have discounted and discarded every prophet I've ever sent them, but they'll listen to Him. And how often did people turn their back on the voice of Jesus? I don't want to hear what Jesus has to say. I don't want to listen to what Jesus has to say, but I'll sit at home and start asking questions. Why isn't God speaking to me? And every Sunday, God is here begging and talking to you. It's a challenge for us, but I want you to appreciate the answer to that question. When Gideon says, where's God been? God's already been talking to him. Point number two, not only has God been talking to him, but God encourages him to this truth that He will be with him. If you're wondering where God is, God says, no, I'll be right here beside you. As we look at the text again from Judges chapter 6, He says, please, Lord, how can I save Israel? And He says, let me tell you how you're going to save Israel. Because I will be with you. I'll be with you. Let me explain something to you. And the Bible tries to tell us this from the beginning to the end. By ourselves, we can do nothing. Every problem in life, you can stub your toe on it, you can stumble over it, you can be crushed by 1,000 things in this life and never get up. Whether it's addiction or your poor choice in relationships or your bad money issues or whatever it is in this life, anything at any turn can crush you. But if God is with you, there is nothing that can defeat you. There's nothing that can stop you. There's no problem that can't be repaired. There's no sin that can't be forgiven. There's no enemy that can't be overcome. And so when he's sitting there looking at the angel of Yahweh, which then if you notice in the next verse, it just simply said, Yahweh said to him. God manifesting himself in some way to Gideon. And Gideon says, no, I can't do it. God simply says this back. You can, because I'll be with you. I'll be with you. What can you do with God with you? You can accomplish anything. Any problem, anything in your life, any difficulty, any stress, any anxiety, when you cast that upon God, He will take care of it because He cares for you. Now, you've been out in the world fighting all these things alone. You've been trying to solve your own problems, do things your own way, and let me tell you where that ends up. You end up hiding from the enemy, just trying to scrape by and get by. And here God is calling him out of the winepress and saying, why don't we go take back this country and take back this kingdom? And it seems unfathomable that your life and all its problems that have been happening for years can suddenly be unwound and picked apart and the tangles made straight. And it's like there's no way this can happen. And it can happen because God is with you. God is with you. Now, how is God with him? Is God going to stand beside him? Is he going to see for the rest of his life a visual image of God? No. But he's going to learn to trust and have faith that God means what he says. And when you believe in the promises of God and you come to have faith in what God has said, then that faith can move whatever mountain is in your life. Now, you might say, all right, I get it, but I'm really struggling with this type of lesson. Because isn't it hard when you're weak to even imagine getting up off the mat and trying again? Going and facing life and saying, hey, I can do it. And that's what makes this story so great. God understands our weaknesses. You know, God didn't look at Gideon and what Gideon said, and God said, well, this is not very faith-like. I'm going to punish you again. God took Gideon from his difficult spot, from his brokenness, from his weakness, and God said, you know what? I'm going to be patient and kind and understanding with you. And this is what God said. And we've seen this in the rest of this text, and I'll read it with you. And so the first thing that God is going to ask him to do, all right, this is the first thing God asks Gideon to do when it comes to cleaning up his life, is he needs to clean up his mess at home. That's the first thing he needs to clean up. And here's what had happened. At their house, at their situation, there was an idol that had been set up. A couple of idols. And God said, here's what I want you to do. You're going to have to tear these things down. You're going to have to tear them down. You're going to take these idols that you guys have been worshiping, and you're going to have to destroy it. And he said, okay, well, I'm going to do it. But notice what it said in verse 27. He took 10 of his men, of his servants, and did as Yahweh had spoken to him. And now it happened because he was too afraid of his father's household and the men of the city to do it by day. He did it by night. Now you could almost preach a lesson, I think, on, what cowardice looks like. And I think I want everybody to stand strong, stand in the gap, and be a man and a woman that can publicly portray Christ crucified in the face of all opposition. And I want that for you. But God allows us to take little baby steps of faith in our relationship to him. And this is what we see God doing. Let's not start with taking over the country. Let's not start with taking things back. But can you go try to get your house to worship God again? Can you cut out the idols and stop those things? And it said that Gideon was afraid of his own family and of the people around him. And I appreciate that. I appreciate that it's hard for you to turn your life around. And if you're struggling and you're wondering where God's at, and you're like, all right, God's going to be with me. I'm going to take some steps to correcting things in my life because God's been telling me to do this and I've been ignoring it. And I'm going to start at home. And that's a step of fear there. It's a step of fear there to go in where your kids are watching something they shouldn't be watching and cut that off and say, now y'all not going to like this, but we got to change our lives. To tell your kids at 9 a.m., we need to get up. It's time for church. I'm still struggling with that one. Yeah, man. People don't like, I don't want to be woken up. Come on, come on. And yet, what are we doing? You got to get your house in order. You got to get things going at home. And God appreciates when we still struggle and are scared to do that. And he did it at night. And I love the rest of the text. They said to one another in the morning, verse 29, who did this thing? And when they searched about and inquired, they said, Gideon, the son of Joash, did this thing. Then the men of the city said to Joash, bring out your son, that he may die, for he has torn down the altar of Baal. And indeed he's cut down the Asherah which was beside it. But Joash said to all who stood against him, will you contend for Baal? Or will you save him? Whoever will contend for him shall be put to death by morning. If he's a god, let him contend for himself, because someone has torn down his altar. Therefore on that day he named him Jerubbaal, that is to say, let Baal contend against him. So here's what you see happening, and this is so great. Where nobody has his back and he's scared and he's doing it at night, Gideon's small step toward change emboldened and encouraged his family to stand up for what was right. Now let's not get so excited about Baal here. I mean, if Baal's a god and Baal's upset about it, let Baal kill him. Why should we kill him? And so you start to see these small steps of weakness encourage him over and over again. And it's right after this that you still see Gideon said to God in verse 36, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have spoken, behold, I will put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor, and if there's dew on the fleece only, and it's dry on all the ground, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have spoken. Again, this is another moment of weakness. I mean, Jesus chastises people in the New Testament for asking for signs. And yet here is Gideon in this moment of still fear, like, God, I need your help. Can you show me even a small sign that something is like you're going to be here with me? And sure enough, it happens. But in his weakness, what does he do in the very next verse? God, do not let your anger burn against me, that I may speak once more. Please let me make a test once more with the fleece. Let it now be dry only on the fleece, and let there be dew on all the ground. And God did so that night. So it was dry only on the fleece, but dew was all on the ground. God understands us. Even in our weakness and our struggles, God understands us, and God wants to encourage us. Time and time again, he demonstrated this to Gideon. And in chapter 7, as we turn the page, when Gideon is ready to go forward in battle to take over all of Midian and take Israel back, God has one more thing that's going to require some testing. He gets all these men to go fight, and God says there's too many people. I don't want you thinking that it was through strength of arms that you guys have defeated Midian. I want to whittle the army number down a little bit. So he does it until there's 300 men. So again, who wants to fight innumerable armies with 300 people? Nobody. And so here Gideon, in his weakness, acknowledges he's afraid again. And notice what God in his kindness says in verse 10. But if you are afraid to go down, then both you and Purah, your young man, go down into the camp, and you will hear what they say. And afterward your hands will be strengthened, that you may go down against the camp. And so as he takes God up on this, he's like, okay. And so they sneak into a guard post, and they're hearing this conversation between Midianite soldiers, and this one soldier tells another one, I had this dream that this wild loaf of bread is like coming in and knocking things down. Man, it's got to be Gideon. I think that represents Gideon, and we may be in trouble. And when Gideon overhears these Midianite guards talking, he's like, oh yeah, I can do it. Brethren, that's the God we serve. That he takes us in our weakness, and God is encouraging and growing Gideon's faith until he's able to accomplish everything that God has for him. Where is God? Where is God right now? God is where he's always been. God has been speaking to you. God has been trying to talk to you if you would listen. God has promised to be with you. God has promised to encourage you. And even in your weakness, God loves you and will accept you and help you. And that's a lesson for you this morning. Now, if you've had a bad week, I just want to encourage you to this end. This is where God is. And I'll leave you with this verse I read this week from Zechariah chapter 1 at the very beginning, where God says, return to me, says the Lord of hosts, and I will return to you. And that's my call to you this morning. What do you need to do to have God in your life? Here's what it is. Return to Him, and He'll return to you. It's a true statement that I'll say to you. God has never left any one of us, but we have walked away from God. God has never abandoned you. God has never forgotten you. God has never stopped loving you. You have abandoned God. You have stopped loving God. You have forgotten God. And if you're waiting on God to make the first move, God is waiting on you. You return to Him, and He'll return to you. If you're here this morning and you haven't done that, I encourage you to do it. And God can take you the rest of the way. God can be there. But if you want to see God, you come to Him. And that's our invitation this morning.